Derrida by Paul Strathern. Read by Jonathan Keeble. Introduction. I love nothing better than remembering and memory itself, claimed Jacques Derrida in his 1984 memoir of his close friend, the philosopher Paul de Man, who had recently died. Yet at the same time, Derrida confessed, I have never known how to tell a story. These two characteristics are far from being contradictory for the author. As he says of himself, it is precisely because he keeps the memory that he loses the narrative. The image remains legible. Incorporating it in a story inevitably blurs this legibility, imposing interpretation. So far, so good. It thus comes as something of a surprise when we discover that the ensuing memoir contains not a single image of his friend and absolutely no memories of him. Needless to say, there is not even a hint of story about him. This would impose interpretation. Yet paradoxically, this entire so-called memoir is devoted to an interpretation of his friend's intellectual achievement. In his own words, Derrida dialogues obliquely with de Man's work, obscurely interpreting it with regard to prudent explication, and a battery of performative acts by such figures as Heidegger, Austin, Hölderlin, and Nietzsche. Any clear, common-sense approach to Derrida's work thus labours under a severe disadvantage. Worse still, it goes completely against the author's intention. It is therefore only fair to warn the reader that my attempt at clarity in the ensuing description of Derrida's life and work would be regarded by its author as both counterproductive and hopelessly biased. Wit, on the other hand, is definitely permitted. Derrida is a great believer in jokes, puns, and humour. Yet here again we suffer a setback. This is specifically French intellectual humour. It derives from that modernist tradition of European continental art and thought known as the absurd. When confronted with an absurd situation, innocent outsiders living beyond this privileged intellectual territory are wont to laugh. Such naivety displays a woeful misunderstanding. The absurd is a notion of utmost seriousness. Similarly with Derrida's humour. This is no laughing matter. It is not funny, except to French intellectuals. Such humour doesn't play for laughs. Derrida may share a Jewish background with Woody Allen, but by no stretch of the imagination do they share a common humour. Whether the Manhattan hypochondriac or the great Parisian intellectual sheds more light on our varied humanity, in other words, is more serious, is another question. Derrida's life and works. Central to Derrida's deconstructionist philosophy is his insistence, there is nothing outside the text. Despite this, and no matter which textual form it takes, the fact that Jacques Derrida was born in Algeria in 1930 would appear to remain impregnable to deconstructive assault. His family were petty bourgeois, assimilated Jews, both part of the French colonial class and yet partial outsiders within it. He grew up in the capital, the seaside city of Algiers. Here, the Europeans lived the easygoing, empty Mediterranean life revolving between business, café, and beach, so tellingly evoked by the French-Algerian writer and philosopher Albert Camus in The Outsider. Derrida lived on Rue Saint-Augustin, a fact that would play a leading yet somewhat serendipitous role in his 1991 autobiography. This he called Circumfession, its title implying the two main topics, circumcision and confession. Yet by the end of the work, we are left little the wiser about details of either. At one point, apparently referring to himself, Derrida writes, he circumcises himself, the lyre in one hand, the knife in the other. Yet some pages later he writes, circumcision remains the threat of what is making me write here. The confessional element is equally muddied. At one point he addresses the reader with regard to his mother. I lied to her all the time, as I do to all of you. There follows a long Latin quotation from the Confessions of St. Augustine. Derrida's Circumfession has many Latin quotes from St. Augustine, with whom he seeks to identify. St. Augustine was in fact born in 354 AD in the Roman colony of Numidia, whose territory now forms part of Algeria. Other resemblances to the early Christian philosopher and religious confessionist are more fleeting. Besides identifying with St. Augustine, Derrida also fantasizes about him, envisioning the Christian saint as a little homosexual Jew from Algiers or New York, and even refers to his own impossible homosexuality. At another point he professes, "I do not know St. Augustine." Having established this much, we can now move on to more factual ground. In 1940, when Derrida was just 10 years old, Algeria was dragged into World War II. Although the country never saw fighting, or even so much as a German uniform, the war cast its pestilential shadow over life in the French colony, which had now become a protectorate of the Nazi Empire. Again, Camus captures the atmosphere of the period, this time in The Plague. France had been overrun, and French Algeria was governed by the collaboration regime. In line with Nazi decrees, in 1942 racial laws were introduced, bringing to the surface a latent anti-Semitism amongst the European population. Derrida was informed by a master at school, "French culture is not made for little Jews." It was the privilege of the top pupil to raise the French flag each morning at school, but in Derrida's case, this was reassigned to the second in the class. A quota system was introduced, limiting each lycée, high school, to 14% Jews. Derrida's headmaster soon took it upon himself to reduce this quota to 7%, and Derrida was expelled. At street level, such attitudes degenerated to name-calling and even violence. The effect of all this on an exceptionally intelligent, sensitive pupil can only be imagined. It's also equally understandable that the man who emerged from this experience should deny the effect of his early life on his later thought. After all, his avowed aim was to interrogate philosophy, not himself. Consequently, he remained averse to supplying personal details that appeared to provide a causal link between his life and his work. And with some justice. It should be remembered that the mature survivor thought out his philosophy despite such attempts to sabotage his intellectual and social life. For a while, the early teenage Jacques received no education. He was enrolled at the unofficial Jewish lycée, but secretly played truant most of the time. He was aware of belonging to Judaism, yet though he had grown up assimilated into European society, he now felt he was not a part of it. His painful experience led him to reject racism of any sort, yet in the words of his collaborator, Geoffrey Bennington, he also experienced impatience with gregarious identification, with the militancy of belonging in general, even if it is Jewish. Upon the resumption of normal education after the war, Derrida became a disruptive pupil, successful only on the playing field. He dreamed of becoming a professional football player. Such an ambition may not have been quite so Philistine as it appears. Just over 10 years earlier, Camus had played in goal for Racing Algiers, and it was during this period that Derrida overheard by chance a talk about Camus on the radio, which attracted him to philosophy. Derrida's hero was a thinking man of action. Despite his teenage rebellion, Derrida's exceptional intellect remained unmistakable. At 19, he was sent to Paris to study for entry to the École Normale Supérieure, the most prestigious higher education establishment in France. But living alone amidst the grey, cold streets of Paris proved an alienating experience after the sea and sunlight of Algiers. Derrida found himself drawn to the nihilistic existentialist philosophy of Sartre, which was then all the rage in the student cafes of the left bank. Sartre asserted existence before essence. He maintained that there was no such thing as an essential humanity. Our subjectivity was not given to us. We create it ourselves by our actions. The way we choose to live makes us who we are. As a result of exam pressure, disorientation and pill-taking, amphetamines and sleeping pills, Derrida walked out after taking his first exam and suffered a minor nervous breakdown. In 1952, at his second attempt, he gained admission to the École Normale Supérieure, where he studied philosophy for the next 5 years. Here, Derrida began a close reading of the two figures who had most influenced Sartre, the German philosophers Husserl and Heidegger. These early 20th century thinkers had been instrumental in developing and elaborating phenomenology, the philosophy of consciousness. This insisted that our fundamental consciousness lies beyond the reach of rational proof or scientific evidence. It is accessible only to intuition. By means of this alone we arrive at the central problems of being, of existence itself. The basis of all our knowledge thus lies beyond reason and science. Our knowing is grounded in consciousness. In 1954, the Algerian War broke out when the local Arab and Berber populations rose against the French in a bid for independence. Derrida supported the struggle for independence, but after graduating in 1957, he was called up to serve in Algeria with the French army. He volunteered to teach and was posted outside Algiers to a school for the children of French and Algerian soldiers in the French army. Derrida found himself torn by the increasing atrocities of both sides, but still hoped for an independent Algeria where Europeans could coexist with their Arab and Berber neighbours. Derrida's family had lived in Algeria for more than 5 generations and regarded themselves as Algerians rather than French. In 1960, he returned to France, where he obtained a post teaching philosophy and logic at the Sorbonne, part of the University of Paris. He was now married to Marguerite Couturier, who had been a fellow student at the École Normale Supérieure. She had accompanied him to Algeria, but was unable to prevent him from suffering a severe depressive episode after his return. The war would end with Algeria's independence in 1962 and the mass exodus of Europeans. Derrida's cherished hope of becoming a citizen of an independent Algeria was shattered. From this time on, he would frequently experience feelings of what he called nostalgia. But 1962 would also see the inception of Derrida's own independence as a philosopher, with the publication of his first important work. To a translation he had made of Edmund Husserl's Origin of Geometry, he appended a book-length introduction which dwarfed Husserl's essay-length work. Husserl had originally been a mathematician, which led him to see the danger of phenomenology basing all knowledge on intuition or the immediacy of individual apprehension. If the basis of all knowledge lay beyond reason and science, how could one know the truth of anything that was not based upon his own intuition? This meant that mathematical and scientific knowledge was relative. Such propositions as 2 + 2 = 4 were not incontrovertible. They just arose from one's intuition of the world. Others might intuit things differently, in which case one would have no grounds to refute them. Husserl sought to rescue philosophy from this difficulty, which threatened to undermine all knowledge. He took geometry as the most certain form of our knowledge, using it as a paradigm for all scientific and mathematical knowledge. If our knowledge of geometry could be shown to be beyond relativism, this would secure the truth of all such science. Husserl argued that geometry must have had a historical origin. Its origin lay in an original intuition by a historical human being. On a particular day in prehistory, a particular individual must have had an intuition of line or distance or possibly even of a point. In this subjective way, geometry, line, distance, point, and so forth, had begun. Such original terms must have had a clear, irrefutable meaning, first grasped by intuition. But once these terms had been grasped by intuition, the rest of geometry was simply a matter of discovering the logical implications of these grounding assumptions. In ancient Greek times, Euclid had shown how the structure of geometry was built up from such basic concepts. Geometry itself was somehow already there, waiting to be discovered, abiding its historical moment. Once the original notions had been intuited, the rest was incontestable. There could be no relativism about it. All scientific and even philosophical knowledge worked in this manner. Yes, in line with the strictures of phenomenology, It was certainly grounded on intuition, historically speaking. But no, it was not relative, because it followed on from these original intuitions by logical steps that uncovered a structure that was in a way already there, just waiting to be discovered. Derrida was convinced that this argument contained an aporia, an internal inconsistency which remained irresolvable. And in arguing this in his introduction to Husserl's Origin of Geometry and in later works, he laid the basis for his philosophical attitude. For Derrida's philosophy is not a philosophy as such. It is rather a questioning of philosophy, an interrogation of its very possibility. He questions the entire basis of philosophy and its ability to operate on its own terms. The whole structure of philosophy is flawed by an aporia, and as such it cannot be consistent. This was more than an obscure argument about the basis of geometry. It questioned the possibility of philosophy itself, and as such, the grounds of all knowledge. According to Derrida, Husserl saw geometry as a form of perfect knowledge, which existed in a realm of timeless truth. It was incontestable and remained true regardless of human apprehension or intuition. For Derrida, any possible prehistoric intuition was irrelevant to the way geometry had come to be regarded in history as the paradigm of all scientific and philosophical truth. This was an ideal truth, beyond the realms of argument. Derrida contested this. Even if the basic concepts of this truth had been historically or prehistorically intuited, the truth itself was not grounded in lived experience. According to Husserl, it had already existed out there, waiting to be discovered. Hence, this truth could not possibly be grounded in lived experience. It was not consciously intuited, the necessary grounding required by phenomenology for all knowledge. Here, at the very heart of philosophy, was an aporia. By implication, our entire notion of knowledge was inconsistent. Either our knowing was grounded in intuition, or it wasn't. It couldn't somehow be both. How do we know that geometry is out there waiting to be discovered? And surely we accept geometry as true because we apply logic to it, rather than intuit this. It may be logically consistent within its own terms, but how do we intuit it as knowledge? What basis in our consciousness, the ultimate grounding of our knowledge, do we have for accepting its truth? Such questions may appear niggling, but their implications affect the whole of Western philosophy and the scientific knowledge that is based upon it. Heidegger had asked similar questions, and in doing so had revealed a hidden assumption that underlay the entire structure of our knowledge. And far from being grounded in individual intuition, this assumption was purely metaphysical. That is, it was somehow above and beyond our physical world. It wasn't based on experience of any sort. Heidegger showed that the whole notion of Western philosophy and its attendant scientific knowledge was based upon the idea that somehow, somewhere, truth itself could be validated in some absolute sense. There was a realm of truth that was not relative. The somewhere out there where geometry existed was part of a realm, a presence where absolute truth existed. It also guaranteed all truth. Here, truth was validated by its own presence. It existed. Otherwise, it would have been an absence. This presence was absolute, guaranteeing absolute truth. The identity of this existent presence can be none other than a form of being that knows all things and knows the truth of all things, including itself. This is the meaning of its truth. There is a coincidence of being and knowing in this presence which guarantees the truth of all things. As Derrida would show, this guarantee of truth, this presence, reveals another aporia. The philosophical idea of a truth based purely on intuition falls victim to its own inner contradiction. Absolute truth can be guaranteed only by an absolute realm or presence. Any lesser finite truth must inevitably be relative. There is no way that a finite intellect, limited to its own intuition, can possibly know whether the truth of what it knows by intuition in any way matches the truth of what is. Such a coincidence, such an equality, could be guaranteed only by an absolute that it couldn't intuit. It's not difficult to detect the ghostly presence of the divine behind the argument for presence. For many centuries, God had been the truth, guaranteeing such absolute truth. But without such a presence, call it divine or absolute, there is no truth, and we are left floundering in a quagmire of relativism. This applies to geometry as much as it does to philosophy. Indeed, Derrida would claim that such a state of affairs denies even the possibility of philosophy. Now it becomes clear why he doesn't see himself as a philosopher. Philosophy had been down this road before. In the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume accepted that all our knowledge was based upon experience. He then analysed this seemingly uncontroversial empirical assertion and came to some surprising conclusions. Take such empiricism to its limits, and our knowledge is reduced to ruins. We do not actually experience causality. Instead of one thing causing another, all we actually perceive is one thing following another. Similarly, we do not actually experience bodies, merely collections of sense data. We do not even experience ourself. We have no direct experience of self, no impression that corresponds to identity. Nor do we experience anything that tells us that this so-called self is identical from one moment to the next. Such trenchant reduction of truth to experience, a recognizable forerunner of phenomenological intuitionism, halted philosophy in its tracks. But it did not put an end to philosophy. It also did not put an end to human knowledge, especially science, which is based upon such notions as causality, identity, continuity, and so forth. All Hume had done was to demonstrate the status of our knowledge. When confronted with such rigid logical analysis, the illogic of our experience simply falls apart. Philosophy may on occasion undermine the status of our knowledge completely. Theory can reduce its status to nothing. But this doesn't stop the practice of our attempts to gain it. This is certainly true in the fields of mathematics and hard sciences such as physics. We still attempt to gain knowledge in a scientific manner, even when anti-philosophers such as Heidegger and Derrida succeed in exploding our entire notion of scientific truth. Perversely, we even continue to apply scientific method in fields that have yet to become established as science. Chaos theory demonstrates how the movement of a butterfly wing in the Brazilian rainforest can eventually result in a tornado in Kansas. The wildly differing effects of the many variables involved in meteorological forecasting are too incalculable for us to predict the weather far ahead with any certainty. The same applies to all economic predictions, as well as the workings of psychoanalysis. These are not yet sciences, and may never become so. But the fact is that we continue as best we can to apply scientific rigor in these fields. Derrida's denial of geometric truth, of even the possibility of philosophy, is in its own abstract way subject to just the same strictures. In undermining truth, he also succeeds in undermining the truth of what he is saying. As we shall see, Derrida would readily admit this, and would follow its implications through to daring and radical conclusions. But the fact is that such theory, whether or not it is sabotaged by its own contradictions, flies in the face of human practice. We practice economics and meteorology because the unfounded knowledge they produce helps us. We may accept that there is no such thing as absolute truth, no final guarantee for our knowledge, yet when all's said and done, we do not question that the three angles of a plane surface triangle add up to 180 degrees. An electron within an atom is comparable in size to a needle in a football stadium, yet we have discovered exact calculations for precisely predicting its behavior. The entire computer industry relies upon such predictions. And we accept other less mathematical scientific truths, such as Darwin's theory of evolution, the structure of DNA, and so forth. Indeed, Even while accepting that there is no absolute truth, we paradoxically and fiercely oppose any attempt to undermine such non-absolute truths by other than scientific disproof, i.e., experiment, experience. Truth may be relative in terms of absolute status, but treating it as relative is another matter. Derrida, for one, would presumably not deny the truth that millions of Jews died in the Holocaust. Western civilization may have developed using a self-contradictory notion of absolute truth, but without this self-contradictory notion it falls apart. Just how Derrida would come to terms with this, and the impossibility of philosophy, is vital to any assessment of his stature as a thinker. In 1965, Derrida began teaching the history of philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure. By now he had become part of the group of emergent Parisian intellectuals, associated with the avant-garde magazine Tel Quel, So What? Despite its flippant title, this was no lightweight gadfly journal. Its aim was to develop a new intellectual terrorism, which would subvert all previous conceptions of writing, literary criticism, and philosophy. Among those who wrote for it at one time or another were all the leading new French thinkers: Barthes, Foucault, Kristeva, and Derrida. Inevitably, their initial loose-knit aims would soon diverge. Derrida's aim was nothing less than to destroy all writing by demonstrating its inevitable falsehood. The writer writes with one hand, but what is he doing with the other? All writing, all texts, have their own hidden agenda, contain their own metaphysical assumptions. This is especially true of language itself. The writer often remains oblivious of this fact. The very language he uses inevitably distorts what he thinks and writes. In Writing and Difference, 1967, Derrida attacked that epitome of French thought, the 17th-century rationalist Descartes, the first modern philosopher. By means of reason, Descartes had sought the ultimate intellectual certainty. In order to clear the ground, he had begun a process of systematic doubt. As a result, he found that he could doubt the certainty of everything. His senses could deceive him. Even his sense of reality sometimes couldn't distinguish between dreaming and waking. Likewise, a cunning, malicious spirit could even be tricking him about the absolute certainty of mathematics. And some 3 centuries later, Derrida would claim to show how this could be the case. But in the end, Descartes found that there was one thing which he just could not doubt. This was the ultimate certainty, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. No matter how he was deceived by the world, the one thing he couldn't doubt was that he was thinking. Derrida disagreed. Basically, he asserted that Descartes remained at the mercy of the language he used. It was impossible for him to reach outside the very language in which he thought, with all its hidden assumptions and its structure, which constricted and distorted his thought. Its very dynamic and methodology was capable of leading his thought astray far more than any delusions of his senses. Such strictures were inherent in the essence and very project of language, of all language in general. For instance, it was simply grammar that led Descartes to conclude, I think, therefore I am. His ultimate experience of certainty, as Hume would later show, contained no notion of identity or even causality. Therefore I am. Ultimately, Descartes was aware only of the coexistence of thought and being. Perhaps this thinking and existence were even identical. As Heidegger would later put it, our fundamental apprehension is being in the world. This is the intuition of phenomenology, beyond reach of reason and science. In another of his major works of this period, Of Grammatology, 1967, Derrida elaborates the notions that have remained central to his thinking. Vital to Derrida's attack on philosophy is undecidability. One of the deepest hidden assumptions of Western thought is the basic rule of logic, often referred to as the law of excluded middle. This concerns identity, and in its earliest form, proposed by Aristotle, it stated, "There is nothing between asserting and denying." In other words, a statement is either true or false. It cannot be neither or both. Well before Derrida, exceptions had been noted to this rule. The proposition, "this statement is a lie," defeats logic on its own ground. The proposition, "he grinned fatly," can be seen as either empty of meaning, misapplication of categories, or poetically meaningful, to describe a chubby infant's smile. Indeed, all poetic statements, all images, all art even, contravenes the law of excluded middle. Take Shakespeare's "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." The world is certainly not a stage, made of wood and set up before an auditorium, and yet, in another imagistic sense, we play out the action of our lives just like actors on a stage. An image, like a picture, both is and is not what it portrays. Then there are statements that are metaphysical and thus unverifiable. Beyond our universe lies eternity. Or ones that may be grammatically correct but remain empty of all meaning. The curlicue cunningly crashes coronary crimping. A pint of plain is your only man. But Derrida went still further. He argued that previously philosophy had been mistaken in searching for essential truth that was somehow contained in the essence of things. On the contrary, it should have concentrated on the language it uses. This does not have any essential equivalence with the objects or even the concepts that it names and describes. That is not how language achieves meaning. All we find in language is a system of differences, and meaning simply arises from these differences. Yet such differences are multifarious and subtle. There is no way in which the many shades of difference found in language can be reduced to a simple bedrock of logic that establishes identity. Derrida claimed that Western thought, and especially philosophy, had been based upon the binary notion implicit in the law of excluded middle. Our defining concepts depended upon opposition. A statement was either true or false. A thing was either alive or dead. A location was either inside or outside, high or low, up or down, left or right. And so it went. Positive, negative, good, evil, general, particular, mind, body, masculine, feminine. This was how we divided and classified our experience in order to give it meaning. One obvious objection to this method is that the meaning of one term depends upon the meaning of the other. In other words, the process is circular. It relates to itself rather than what it purports to describe. For Derrida, this indicated the essential defect in such laws and their reasoning. They contained a hidden metaphysical assumption that they described some essential reality, and that this essential reality was characterized by a logical coherence. The reasoning found in logic was also found in reality. Such thinking not only assumed an essential reality, in the presence of an absolute truth, but also that this reality was logical. The entire notion of an absolute truth that contradicted the laws of logic was inconceivable. Consciousness, our intuition of the world, is beyond logic. It intuits no presence of absolute truth. We know ourselves and the world through consciousness and the mirror of language. They are the grounding of our knowledge, what makes it possible. Yet this process, beyond reason and logic, is in fact excluded from the process by which we obtain knowledge, logic, reason, and so forth. The differences that give rise to meaning in language are transformed by logic into distinctions, identities, truths. For Derrida, this contradiction inevitably undermines the truth of knowledge. According to Derrida, our knowledge of the world, based upon identity, logic, and truth, stems from an aporia. It is the result of an inner contradiction. Once again, it's easy enough to point out Derrida's self-contradiction here. If the presence of a contradiction invalidates our logical knowledge, then surely the use of logic in Derrida's argument is equally damaging. Despite Derrida's argument shooting itself in the foot in this fashion, the argument itself is not new. Even before Hume, the 17th-century Irish empiricist philosopher Berkeley managed to disprove mathematics to his own satisfaction by using mathematics. He pointed out a number of inconsistencies which could only be rectified by introducing arbitrary rules into this system that apparently consisted solely of necessary truths. Thus, mathematics was not logically certain. For instance, 12 times 0 equals 0. 13 times 0 equals 0. Therefore, 12 times 0 equals 13 times 0. Divide both sides by 0, therefore 12 equals 13. According to Berkeley, this anomaly could be rectified only by introducing the arbitrary rule that you can multiply by 0 but not divide by it. More damagingly, Berkeley also pointed out the inherent logical flaw in Newton's calculus. Either the infinitesimals that Newton employed existed, or they didn't. His calculus switched in mid-calculation from one to the other, and despite his considerable use of the law of excluded middle in this argument, Berkeley also went on to disprove this law too, also with the use of logic. These exposures of flaws in the certainty of mathematics, and thus all certain knowledge, reached their apotheosis around the time of Derrida's birth. In 1931, the Austrian mathematician Gödel managed to prove, again by mathematical logical methods, that mathematics could never be certain. Any rigidly logical system, such as mathematics, is bound to contain certain propositions that can neither be proved nor disproved by use of the basic axioms on which that system rests. This was in fact far more damaging to mathematics than anything Derrida was to produce, because it indicated the possibility that mathematics itself is capable of giving rise to mathematical contradictions. It also broke the law of excluded middle. Such propositions were neither true nor false within the system. As we have seen, Derrida wished to go one step further, by invalidating the entire process of logic. And despite his protestations to the contrary, he did this by using logical argument. What Derrida adds that is essentially new to the 250-year-old arguments of Berkeley and Hume, or the final argument of Gödel, is debatable. And it's arguable that the distinction between intuition and rational thought reaches back over 2,000 years to the earliest Greek era of philosophical thought. Derrida would of course argue that intuition and reason are simply not applicable, one to the other, or at least that such application does not produce the certainty that is claimed for it. Mathematics and science were able to survive Berkeley and Hume, and have continued regardless since Gödel. Derrida's strictures would seem to be equally effective. So what does this indicate? It was indeed a surprise, and a great blow to mathematical pride, to discover that mathematics was not quite as certain as it was assumed to be. For science, it was another matter. Quite simply, science was well aware of this all along, or at least has been increasingly so. Scientific theories, then modified or scrapped together when they conflict with reality, experimental findings. Scientific truth has not been absolutely certain or seen as such by scientists for some centuries now. Galileo was modified by Newton. Newton, in turn, was replaced by Einstein. Science is truth that works, not truth that is certain. And the same can be said, perhaps to a lesser degree, of all human knowledge. Derrida argues that we ignore the point here. For most of us, the presence of some absolute truth lingers on in our attitude to knowledge. Such argument does not bear closer examination. As in science, so in the lesser certainties of history. Where such things as historical fact, the Holocaust, for example, are concerned, we behave as if the presence lingers on. We accept this event as true because of evidence, which of its very nature is open to interpretation, modification, or even contradiction. We accept the Holocaust as scientifically certain, not absolutely so. But Derrida's purpose here is not entirely negative. Far from it. His main avowed aim is to include those very elements that logic and clarity sought to exclude from the rich flow of our conscious intuition. In reducing our experience to such knowledge, we exclude the full richness of what our experience is. Again, this insight is scarcely original. Knowledge is abstract. It abstracts from experience. The original Latin meaning of abstract is to draw. Traction has the same root. Out of or away from, as in absent. In other words, by implication, to reduce the whole. Again, the process was initiated in human experience not in order to discover some absolute truth, but in order to survive, to make use of experience, to gain power over the world around us. It was technical, scientific, before its much later pretensions to absolute truth. But Derrida's central argument here does concern how we use our knowledge, be it intuitional or so-called logical. How do we express ourselves and our knowledge? In language. But this too is not absolute, precise, or logical. Every word, every phrase, and even the way we place them in sentences begets blurring ambiguities. Language eludes clarity and precision. Every word has its own meaning or meanings. It also brings with it any number of more or less hidden connotations. There are puns, echoing similarities, suggestive references, diverse interpretations, divergent roots, double meanings, and so on. Spoken language may allude to the double meanings in its intention. The comedian places camp emphasis on the innocent remark that is open to a far from innocent interpretation. Some statements may, under certain circumstances, even unwittingly convey their opposite. There will be no whitewash at the White House. Likewise with written language. The reader is free to add his own interpretation, attitude, intention. The words on the page, ambiguous in themselves, are merely a sounding board for the reader's interpretation. Derrida carries this analysis to its extreme. Difference without positive terms of identity means that language at this underlying level of meaning is almost completely fluid. If there is no identity, there are no concepts. Such identifying notions are literally inconceivable. This level, amongst the fluidity of puns and jokes, of meanings blending into one another and so forth, eludes clarity. But in doing so, it also alludes to metaphysical presence of absolute truth that Western thought seeks to impose upon language. At this level, analogous in some ways to the unconscious mind, language retains its rich creative mix of undecidability amongst its differences. Once again, the element of ambiguity in language has been clear to poets since literature began. This perhaps accounts for the first reception of Derrida's ideas in America, which he presented in a speech at Johns Hopkins University in 1966. Here, Derrida's treatment of language was seen as an incisive and original tool for literary criticism. This showed how all kinds of new references and meanings could be discerned in a literary text, creating their own subtexts. It could reveal hidden intentions, covert metaphysical assumptions, and implicit ambiguities. On the other hand, Derrida's philosophical community was less enthusiastic. What was he trying to say? Derrida's answer to this question eludes precision in much the same way as language, in Derrida's view, eludes precise meaning. But language does have a meaning. It originated as a means of communication. Even if that communication was only demonstrating inarticulate power of the speaker over the hearer, as in primitive shouting, the intent was to communicate. And this communication of more or less precise meaning has remained its central activity. Literature, as art, continually plays with language and utilizes its playful, ambiguous element. But even this seldom descends into complete nonsense, nonsense. Dadaism, surrealism, and similar isms derive their power from dislocated meaning, anomalous evocations and such. If they didn't, each meaningless text would have the same effect. So of what use is Derrida's analysis? He exposes how the meaning of a text assumes various conventions and contains its own codes. He shows how a text achieves meaning, rather than what it means. He shows how the text is simplified. This method of limiting and manipulating the rich scope of language has always been the case, and is discernible amongst the earliest philosophers. Derrida illustrates this with an example from Plato's Phaedrus. In this, Plato relates the myth of the ancient Egyptian god Thoth, who explained to the king of Egypt the benefit of teaching his subjects how to write. This would enable his subjects to improve their memory and increase their wisdom. Thoth claimed, "My invention is a medicine, pharmakon, for fortifying both memory and wisdom." But the king objected that writing would produce the very opposite effect. "This invention will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who have learned it, because they will not need to exercise their memories, being able to rely upon what is written." Thoth had merely discovered a pharmakon for reminding, not for memory itself. Similarly, with wisdom. The king pointed out that writing would merely produce the appearance of wisdom, not its reality. It would encourage the delusion of wisdom, not actual inner wisdom. Derrida points out that Plato's myth contains a typical use of binary opposites of either-or. Either writing is good for memory, or it isn't. Yet it could in fact be both. Derrida now focuses on the word pharmakon. In Greek, this means medicine, cure, or potion. This is the origin of pharmacy. But pharmakon can also mean poison, bewitchment, or enchanting spell. The word pharmakon thus covers both sides of the argument. Writing can strengthen the power of memory, and it can also drug its powers. The meaning of pharmakon becomes unstable in this context, and this instability introduces difference. Identity, binary, opposites, either-or, these are eliminated, and instead we have the ambiguity of difference. The logic of Plato's argument now begins to unravel, and instead we have undecidability. Not surprisingly, American philosophers were somewhat less than impressed by Derrida's thinking here. Such treatment may have been all very well for literature, but what on earth did it have to do with the clarity of philosophical argument? It sought only to muddy the waters, blur the issues, take apart the concepts. Philosophy sought to eliminate such ambiguity. What was the point of trying to reintroduce it? Derrida countered such objections with two arguments. His attempt was to show the conventions by which philosophy operates, its assumptions of truth, its hidden codes. Second, he pointed out that all language was built upon this subtext of ambiguity. It eluded identity with any real object, and to ignore this was to ignore the fullness of what language is. The philosophers were not the only ones to remain underwhelmed by this argument. Scientists simply regarded it as trivial nonsense. A scientific law is valid until it is disproved, not by the introduction of verbal ambiguities. Lawyers and political thinkers dismissed Derrida's arguments as a joke. Just as Derrida had indicated, each, in his context, retained his own conventions and assumptions. How much they were already aware of this, and how much this mattered, was another matter. Derrida called his process of argument, or philosophical approach, categorize it how you will, deconstruction. This explains with some precision what he does. He takes apart what has implicitly already been put together in a text. The monumental authority of a text is disassembled. Instead of one meaning, it takes on many. After Derrida's first American lecture at Johns Hopkins, deconstructionism quickly began to catch on as an intellectual doctrine. Deconstruction, undecidability, aporia, difference, and the like quickly became the buzzwords of the new campus cult. Johns Hopkins and Yale embraced deconstructionism with some enthusiasm. Other institutions rejected it with equal passion. This split in American academia was soon echoed throughout the world. On the whole, French and continental European philosophers were willing to listen. Britain and other Anglophone countries were dismissive. This binary oversimplification reverberated through different disciplines. Derrida found his followers in philosophy and literary criticism. The sciences regarded it all as so much nonsense. There was no room for relativism in the domain of relativity. In May 1968, Paris was overtaken by les événements, literally the incidents or events. Students took to the streets in conflict with the police, and the left bank became the scene of vicious day and night riots. The students resisted the tear gas and water cannons of the riot police, erected barricades, flung cobblestones, and eventually took over the Sorbonne, effectively controlling the centre of Paris south of the Seine. The trouble quickly spread to universities throughout France, and sympathetic spontaneous strikes broke out in several large factories. The country was brought to a virtual standstill. Many supported the students, but feared the collapse of the state. The explosion of youthful violence arose as a result of years of authoritarian state rule, culminating in the sterility resulting from 10 years of patriarchal government by the aging General Charles de Gaulle. In America, Britain, Germany, and elsewhere, the social and cultural transformations of the 60s were underway. Mass demonstrations against nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War, the revolution in social mores accompanying the arrival of rock music and the hippie movement, as well as the advent of post-war affluence, had brought little change in France. The educational system especially maintained a strong grip on young people. The school curriculum was rigid in the extreme, culminating in the dreaded baccalaureate exam, which marked out success or failure for life. Indeed, the curriculum was so fixed that the Minister of Education could be certain at any given hour on any given day precisely which page of which textbook was being studied in every classroom throughout the land. By contrast, the situation in further education was a shambles, with the minimum of outmoded equipment, lecture halls so overcrowded that often half the students couldn't even get in, irrelevant and useless courses conducted by aged and inept professors, and impoverished living conditions. The new post-Sartre wave of Parisian thinkers, such as Foucault, Barthes, Derrida, and others associated with tel quel, represented the intellectual protest against the sterility of French society. In such a context, it is easier to understand some of the excesses of this movement. Derrida's insistence upon the fluidity of language becomes more comprehensible when seen against a background of authoritarian edicts of the French educational system. His insistence upon the difference of language, instead of the identity of words with their subjects, subverts the prevailing linguistic orthodoxy. This was, and still is, the preserve of the Académie Française, which continues to deliver its pronouncements on French linguistic purity, such as the exclusion of Americanisms and other English words, and the precise meaning of French words. Such constraint produces an intimate sense of oppressiveness. It strikes at the very way one thinks, reaching into the mind itself. English speakers, whose language is under no threat and every day penetrates further into the languages of the world, can have little or no experience of such problems. On the contrary, English has retained its far-flung homogeneity precisely through its ability to adapt, absorb, and withstand. By contrast, consider the fate of Arabic. Classical Arabic script remains comprehensible from Morocco to the Philippines, yet spoken variants of Arabic can be all but incomprehensible from one country to the next. By the middle of the 20th century, American English had begun breathing new life into the moribund formality of the English that was the lingua franca throughout the British Empire, over a third of the globe. And, arguably, that same English had already contributed a range of articulacy and discipline to the fecund variety of American, Indian, Australian, and African variants, holding the whole together. Precisely this fact had prompted many of Derrida's American critics to see his strictures on language and their philosophical implications as irrelevant to the English-speaking world. We already know how language can take on a life of its own, how words can acquire new cadences, or even entirely new meanings. One has only to consider such words as gay, freak, or challenged to see how English is in a constant state of flux. Derrida was in many ways fighting for a freedom that English speakers take for granted. Yet this was of course not his central aim, which was to show that all language was fluid through and through. At the outset of May 1968, Derrida played an active role, taking part in the marches and demonstrations. He even organized an assembly at the École Normale Supérieure, where open debates were held among the students, sympathetic members of staff, and visiting trendy celebrity intellectuals who wished to jump on the bandwagon. Sartre himself was present at one of the assemblies in the Sorbonne, but he was soon howled down. His sympathies may have been with the students, but in truth he had now lost contact with this generation. The old had no real idea of the aspirations of the young. Even Derrida soon found the anarchy, the inarticulateness of demands and speech, the populism and the often determined Philistinism difficult to grasp. The force of youthful feelings that blossomed into such graffiti as "Beneath the street lies a beach," "Tomorrow shines on today," and "We are the writing on the wall," had no place for an intellectual agenda. This had been Sartre's misunderstanding. Derrida maintained sympathy, but he also maintained a low profile. What could he say amidst the uproar of the moment? The world looked on in bemusement as the major cultural capital of the world was turned into an anarchist jamboree. Meanwhile, de Gaulle panicked and secretly fled to Germany to consult with his military leaders, in command of the occupying French troops in the French zone of former West Germany. De Gaulle received the backing of the military, and the disorganized rebellion fell apart as the students set off for their holidays in the Greek islands. But the lesson had been learned. The old days were over. De Gaulle resigned within a year, and died a year after that. France entered the modern world, embarking on the road to populist democracy and youth culture. Workers were granted higher wages, and students were given a say in education. Derrida's lectures at the École Normale Supérieure became increasingly popular. The dashingly handsome, natty dresser with the striking, upswept hairstyle became a cult figure. But this status was not achieved without a few ruffled feathers in the hothouse aviary of Parisian intellectual life. Derrida initially showed sympathy for the views of his contemporary Foucault, who also cut a dashing figure with his trademark shaven head, designer spectacles, and pale polo-neck sweaters. Foucault's cultural relativism was in accord with Derrida's linguistic relativism. Both were seen as leaders of the movement known as post-structuralism, which regarded all knowledge as textual, i.e., a relativistic interpretation of text. History, psychology, philosophy, anthropology, all these dealt not so much with concepts, but with words. For Foucault, this led to epistemes, or paradigms of knowledge, in which power was invested. These structured the thinking of any given age, directing the way in which it thought, and thus determining what it thought about, the aims of its thought, the lacunae of that thought, even ruling out the possibility of thinking in certain ways. For instance, the medieval era, which believed that the world ultimately consisted of earth, air, fire, and water, and mixtures thereof, simply could not conceive of atomic elements. With the advent of each new era, such as the transformation from the Renaissance to the Age of Reason, an entirely new episteme of thought was established. Foucault saw Descartes as the epitome of the Age of Reason. After using reason to doubt everything, to unpick the very fabric of his existence, and, by implication, the certainties of the previous age and its episteme, Descartes had arrived at his basic certainty: I think, therefore I am. But Derrida took issue with Foucault's analysis. In using the language of reason to describe Descartes' method, Foucault had himself subscribed to the episteme of the Age of Reason. Descartes' doubt had in fact unwittingly undermined the very reason it sought to establish as paramount. Reason, too, could be doubted. Descartes' text was open to a far more drastic interpretation than the one placed on it by Foucault. It was a delusion to assume that thought can use a language that stands outside the very language it describes. Foucault, not surprisingly, reacted with some passion to this critique, which threatened to undermine his entire intellectual project, and, it would seem, any other intellectual project. In Foucault's view, Derrida's nitpicking attack was just an intellectual game. This spat eventually led to a split in the entire post-structuralist approach. While Foucault retained the emphasis on the text, especially the historical document, he insisted that it was possible to analyze the power structure adhering to a particular text. The episteme that controlled and limited its writing implied a system of political power. Such a historical text was open to a particular interpretation. Derrida insisted that, like any text, it was open to a multitude of interpretations. The view of any historical document was liable to change from age to age. This may have freed the text from a single authoritative interpretation, but it left Derrida open to the charge that such a text could seemingly be given any interpretation. Derrida's divergence of opinion from his Parisian contemporary, Roland Barthes, was less violent and apparently less fundamental. Barthes was the champion of semiology, whereby a text is studied for its second-order meaning. Intellectual innocents who read a text in order to discover its author's intentions were dismissed as hopelessly naive. The real meaning of any text lay in an analysis of the symbols and the interconnected signs whose structure underlay the surface. Barthes daringly extended such analysis far beyond the texts of philosophy and literature into such diverse realms as fashion, the Eiffel Tower, and even wrestling, where all manner of interconnected signs were to be found grappling beneath the surface. This method of analyzing texts led Barthes to announce the death of the author. What he or she said didn't count. The author was merely a cultural construct, the product of an age, class, sex, socially determined expectations and appetites, and so forth. At its best, Barthes's analysis showed how surface language could overlay a hidden structure of assumptions, making these wholly artificial assumptions appear natural, universal, or even inevitable. This was the case, for instance, with the bourgeois novel and the unquestioned cultural values upon which it rested. Derrida had mixed feelings about the so-called death of the author. He naturally applauded Barthes for stripping bare hidden assumptions and revealing how the universal truths of bourgeois values were in fact no more than an arbitrary construct of prejudices and assumptions. This coincided with his own deconstructionist approach. Here was more evidence of the transcendental presence of Western metaphysics. It was always necessary to expose such truth as purely humanistic. On the other hand, Derrida deplored any assumption that such criticism itself could go beyond the humanistic and, so to speak, emerge on the far side of humanistic ideology, that one day it would be possible to make judgments entirely free from humanism and its inevitable bias. This was impossible. The very language in which such criticism was couched would inevitably contain traces of the humanistic assumptions on which it was based, on which it had grown throughout its history. This argument may appear somewhat circular, but its point was clear enough. We are bound within the circularity of our discourse. Our speech will always be subject to the language we use. We can never step outside its inevitably humanistic colouring. This may appear depressing with regard to any notion of truth beyond the socially agreed construct, yet it does have distinctly heartening implications. The truth as we know it, in the only way we can know it, must remain humanistic. It must remain of the human for the human. Unfortunately, As recalcitrant deists and metaphysicians have been quick to point out, the same can be said of the metaphysical and religious assumptions that have for so long been a part of language. Derrida argues that we must get rid of this presence, yet at the same time he argues that we can never get rid of the humanist presence. It's difficult to see how he can have it both ways, except, of course, in the realm of free interpretation he advocates, which is presumably free to contradict itself. By the late 1960s, Derrida was becoming an increasingly celebrated presence himself. On both sides of the Atlantic, his new deconstructionism was becoming equally fashionable and equally controversial. Not only philosophers and scientists dismissed his ideas as obvious, needlessly complex or incomprehensible nonsense. One well-known English academic even went so far as to claim that his work was all three, a categorization which even Derrida himself might have had difficulty in deconstructing. At the same time, Derrida's former students were becoming a pervasive influence far beyond the confines of Yale and Paris. But the forces of reaction had begun to close ranks. In most of the older universities, on both sides of the Atlantic, there was no room for deconstruction. The death of the author could take place elsewhere. The death of these authors had been greatly exaggerated. In 1970, Derrida's mother died of cancer at the age of 70. The following year, Derrida returned to Algeria for the first time since the country's independence, delivering a series of lectures at the University of Algiers. During his stay, he took the opportunity to visit the seaside villa where he had been born, his kindergarten, and many other sites of childhood memory. His nostalgia was from now on to be rendered all the more poignant by the death of his mother. Cryptic references to these sites of his former life and oblique indications of his feelings about them now began appearing with increasing frequency in his work. But why this elusiveness when he had nothing to hide? Apparently, to express such feelings directly would have been to diminish them. Their vitality would only have been limited by trying to contain them in words, which would have come between the actuality of his memories. Once again we have the pharmacon, which both cures and poisons, betrays and stimulates our memory. The pharmacon, or writing, is like a joker, the wild card in the pack. It can signify anything. Words are difference, not identity. We should be looking at how much words can signify, not attempting to see what they signify. Derrida wishes to keep his memories intact. The reason for his willful elusiveness with regard to autobiography becomes clearer. In his ensuing works, Derrida demonstrated with a vengeance his attitude toward clarity in language. In 1972, he once again produced 3 books. These were Margins of Philosophy, Positions, consisting of several interviews, and Dissemination. The latter was indicative of the direction Derrida's thought was now taking. Dissemination argues once again that there can never be a single fixed meaning to any text. The force of different meanings, puns, associative ambiguities, and similar features is irresistible. This causes a dissemination of meanings, of different interpretations. Derrida makes great play of the fact that the word dissemination contains echoes of seme, the ancient Greek word for meaning, hence our word's semantics. He also points out that it has echoes of semen, thus it ejaculates meaning. The final essay in Dissemination was called Dissemination. Derrida himself proudly proclaimed that this text was undecipherable and unreadable, thus forestalling the hapless critics. But this, alas, was the point. Here Derrida achieved an apotheosis of textuality, the play of differences in meaning, association, undecidability, and so on, ad incomprehensum. 2 random examples. First, a heading. The double bottom of the plus present. Then a sentence. Expropriation thus does not proceed merely by a ciphered suspension of voice, by a kind of spacing that punctuates it, or rather draws its shafts from it or at it. It is also an operation within voice, No brief quotes can possibly do justice to the full extent of which Derrida here managed to elude all meaning in his text, all sense, all sanity even. Likewise, any attempt to give an exegesis of the text is doomed to failure. Indeed, in the view of its author, to do so would only do a serious disservice to the text. The attempt to give it a meaning would merely eliminate any past meanings that it might have contained, as well as the possibility of any future interpretations. Any present meaning imposed upon the text can only be an illusion which attempts to reimpose the presence of some absolute meaning, some absolute truth, which is, of course, a fallacy. Or, to put it in the maestro's inimitable words, each time writing appears as disappearance, recoil, erasure, retreat, curling up, consumption. All this is perhaps best illustrated by a description of what the text is and how it came into being. Derrida's self-styled essay began life as a book review of Numbers by the contemporary French writer Philippe Soler, another member of the Tel Quel group. Numbers boldly claims in its frontispiece to be a novel. It opens with a dedication in Russian, followed on the next page by an epigraph in Latin suggesting the book's limitless heights and depths of interpretation. Seminaque in numero, sumaque profundo. The text itself then starts straight in. The paper was burning, and there was some question of all things drawn and all paintings projected there of the regularly distorted manner, while a phrase was saying, "There is the external surface." 100 pages later, it closes with the words, "Burnt and refusing to put the lid back on, its squared space and depth. 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 to the power of 2 = 100. In Soler's text, this space is occupied by two large Chinese ideograms. In between, Soler's novel is nothing if not novel. Yet this double negative can and does suggest almost anything. Here we find more Chinese ideograms, diagrams, and even puzzles, all contained in a series of largely inconsequential slabs of text, which are said to be related like the shards of a broken mirror. The text also contains quotes from such disparate figures as the 17th-century mathematician and religious zealot Pascal, Karl Marx, the medieval cardinal and prophetic scientific thinker Nicholas of Cusa, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Mao Zedong. Quotes are also included from Bourbaki, the pseudonym adopted by a varying group of French mathematicians who anonymously assume collective responsibility for the somewhat controversial axiomatic mathematical work produced under this name. Bourbaki's pure axiomatic approach stresses that in mathematics one does not know what one is talking about. Neither does one care whether what one says is true in any real sense. The resemblance to the text is presumably intentional and aptly characterizes Derrida's method. The same cannot be said of Wittgenstein, who is also quoted in Numbers. Wittgenstein's philosophic aim was, if anything, diametrically opposed to that of Derrida. Both admittedly claim to have found the final solution to philosophy, thus putting an end to this subject once and for all. And both found the key to this lay in language. Yet here all resemblance ends. Derrida solved the problem of philosophy by the simple expedient of exploding language from the inside, detonating its meaning into myriad fragments of ambiguity, self-contradiction, and punny jokes. Any coherent philosophy, or coherent anything for that matter, was thus rendered impossible. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, viewed philosophy as arising from the tangled knots of meaning arising when words were applied to inappropriate categories. For example, it was simply impossible to ask, "What is the purpose of life?" because such words as purpose and life could not be meaningfully applied to each other. What we call philosophy arose only from mistakes in our use of language. When the knots were unraveled, the mistakes would simply disappear. Not only was there no answer to such philosophical questions, there was no question in the first place. What Wittgenstein and Derrida both had profoundly in common was their view of philosophy as a conjuring trick. But where Wittgenstein made the white rabbit in the hat disappear, Derrida produced an endless cornucopia of them. Derrida's review of numbers does little more than emulate the shattered mirror it claims to be reviewing. It is, to join in the spirit of things, a reflection with reflection, or reflections within a reflection. The original is quoted, mimicked, and even parodied, perhaps wittingly, but not wittily. Indeed, the original's obscurity seems to be taken as a challenge to be outperformed rather than overcome. It even claims that any review would be the same. Some such other enumeration, altogether squarely written, would nevertheless remain undecipherable. Needless to say, some reviewers have managed to find a more direct way of expressing their opinion of Solar's text and its attendant essay. Bullshit was the allegedly undecipherable opinion that sprang to the mind of more than one English-speaking reviewer. Even some of Derrida's closest admirers hoped that this work was an aberration. Where could he possibly go from here? What lay beyond the self-proclaimed unreadable? The answer was not long in coming. 2 years later, in 1974, Derrida published Glace. This work consisted of 2 continuous columns of print. Like Dissemination, these both begin in mid-sentence, but this time they go on for almost 300 pages, with occasional indented passages like remarks and occasional slabs of quotation. The left-hand column, with slightly larger print and closer set lines, consists of a highly original reading of and interweaving of quotes from the 19th century German philosopher Hegel. The other column is a commentary, also with extensive quotation, on the works of the French lyrical pederast writer and jailbird Jean Genet. Both are torturous in their own way, yet the contrast between systematic German metaphysics and systematic French buggery could not be more extreme. No anti-German or homophobic intent is implied here. Of both Hegel and Genet are on a par with Derrida in attacking the sensibilities and expectations of the mere reader. Hegel's page-long sentences of relentless metaphysical jargon qualify him as the Descartes of philosophy. Genet's relationship to Descartes is somewhat less philosophical, but the effect can be equally painful. So what is Glace really about? As we should already be aware by now, the aim of all this is not for us to decide. In the words of Christopher Norris, one of Derrida's more sympathetic critics, Glace is not a book, at least in the traditional sense of that word. A volume whose unifying principle consists in its always referring us back to some privileged source of authorial intention. On the other hand, the typesetting and printing of this non-book was evidently a matter of extremely precise intent to the privileged author. No take-it-or-leave-it limitless interpretation was permitted to the unfortunate printers. As many as 4 different typefaces were employed in the text, one for each column, another for indentations, another for slabs of quoted text, to say nothing of frequent italics, passages in German, ancient Greek and Latin words, and so forth. And, in its original printing, this non-book was assembled so that it had a volume of precisely 100 cubic inches. Its pages were a square 10 inches by 10 inches, and these totaled 1 inch in thickness. I stress, inches. What the French printers who worked in centimetres made of all this might have... But since this book is presented for public consumption, it is legitimate to question whether it means anything at all. Hegel's celebrated dialectical method began with a thesis, which then generated its own antithesis, and these two then merged to form a synthesis. For example, being generates its antithesis, nothingness, and these then synthesize into becoming. Hegel's entire all-embracing system is generated in this fashion. It is possible to read such dialectic at work in Glace. The left-hand Hegelian column becomes the thesis, an example of high philosophy at its highest, Hegel's ultimate intellectual justification for the authoritarian 19th-century Prussian state. And it's not difficult to read the antithesis of this in Genet's rhapsodies on Un jeune garçon blonde, a young blonde boy, and Divin aime Gabriel, se nomme l'archange,
Pour l'amener à l'amour, elle met un peu de son urine dans ce qu'elle lui donne à boire ou à manger. The Archangel Gabriel's urine being used as a love potion. The synthesis presumably takes place elsewhere, possibly in the mind of the reader. Or, as Derrida so tellingly puts it, its interpretation directly engages the whole Hegelian determination of right on one side, of politics on the other. Its place in the system's structure and development is such that the displacements or disimplications of which it will be the object could not have a simply local character. One could be forgiven for concluding that there has to be a limit to this kind of work. Once the indecipherable, unreadable has been produced in one form or another, its purpose is surely served. Derrida did not agree. Despite jetting around Europe to deliver speeches, holding down his academic post in Paris, and simultaneously fulfilling further academic duties at various universities in America, he continued to be stupefyingly prolific. Even by this stage, his production of texts, ranging from book-length non-books to non-articulate articles, ran into the hundreds. What many consider to be his next major work appeared in 1980. This was entitled The Postcard, From Socrates to Freud and Beyond. The fact that Socrates had never sent a postcard, to Freud or anyone else, stems from a trivial deconstruction of this title, but one that is valid nonetheless if one takes Derrida's method at face value. Having got this funny joke out of the way, we can now press on to the more serious joke of the text. This begins with an essay on the postal principle. According to Derrida, this is of more significance than Freud's pleasure principle, for it covers the entire history of Western metaphysics, from Socrates to Freud and beyond. In sending a postcard, or any message, we give something but hold ourselves back from this giving. Great play is made of the relation between the writer, destinateur, and the receiver, destinataire, and the fact that these French words contain links with destiny and destination. In writing earlier on this subject, Derrida had reached the conclusion, "A letter can always not arrive at its destination. The structure of the letter is capable always of not arriving." The main part of the work is given over to an analysis of psychoanalysis. Freud's heroic attempt to raise psychoanalysis to the status of an empirical science is perversely dismissed as metaphysics, despite the fact that this was precisely what Freud was trying to avoid. But then, according to Derrida, any such attempt to establish truth is metaphysical, invoking the presence that has haunted all Western thinking. The fact that Freud ultimately failed to establish psychoanalysis as a hard empirical science, like physics, is thus presumably laudable. In failing to free it from metaphysics, he didn't succeed in basing it on metaphysics. Yet even in the midst of all this, there are some difficult insights that appear worth the effort to unravel. What is neither true nor false is reality. But as soon as speech is inaugurated, one is in the register of the unveiling of the truth, as of its contract of properness, presence, speech, testimony. Speech, which incorporates truth and falsehood, describes a reality that does not incorporate such entities. Philosophy's concern with that reality, or the grounds for our relationship with it, will always place it at one level deeper than science. In the last analysis, scientific knowledge merely seeks to describe our encounter with that reality, rather than the reality itself, or the grounds for our contact with it. It records experimental evidence of our encounters. And here lies the difficulty with Derrida's analysis. The point about speech is that it involves our encounter with this valueless reality. A bottle of arsenic is in itself neither true nor false. The label poison on the bottle, either true or false, describes the reality of a possible encounter rather than the thing itself. This is a scientific truth, not an absolute truth. It is verifiable by experience, not by reference to any absolute presence. In 1981, Derrida's travels took him to Prague, which was then behind the Iron Curtain. Derrida had been instrumental in establishing the Jan Hus Association, named after the 15th-century Czech martyr who defied the power of the Church. The aim of this association was to aid the repressed intellectuals of Czechoslovakia who were being persecuted by the communist regime. At considerable risk to himself and his listeners, Derrida held a week-long seminar. This included a paper entitled Before the Law, echoing the title of a short story by Kafka, who had lived most of his life in Prague. The meaning of this characteristically obtuse talk was nonetheless plain, even to the secret police, who regarded the second syllable of Derrida's deconstructionism as superfluous. Derrida was searched, and a brown packet of marijuana was discovered in his possession. He was immediately locked up. France takes its intellectuals very seriously, even when others find themselves unable to do so. What might have appeared to the Czech authorities as a minor incident, involving a provocative French poseur, was viewed very differently by the Parisian press. France's national heritage was at stake, and President François Mitterrand himself was soon making his feelings plain to the Czech authorities in flagrantly undeconstructed language. 20 years earlier, when French authorities had sought to arrest Sartre for illegal political activity, de Gaulle himself had intervened, informing them, "You don't arrest Voltaire." Sartre thus involuntarily embodied his existentialism, which decreed, "Man is condemned to be free." Derrida was speedily released by the Czech authorities and arrived back in Paris to a hero's welcome. During the previous year, Sartre had died, as had Barthes. 3 years later, Foucault would be dead, leaving Derrida to assume the mantle, which had passed from Descartes through to Voltaire and on to Sartre, of France's greatest living intellectual. Derrida had always seen deconstruction as a tool for use against political authoritarianism and injustice. Yet the politics of deconstruction would appear to resist any explicit manifesto or clear constructive action. According to Derrida, deconstruction should seek a new investigation of responsibility, questioning the codes inherited from ethics and politics. This could, of course, lead to any political stance. Yet despite such intellectual fence-sitting, Derrida himself would play an active role during the mid-80s in the campaign to free Nelson Mandela and end apartheid in South Africa. More controversially, and more dangerously, he also led a campaign against racism in France, a perennial feature of the local political scene, which focused heavily on the large North African immigrant population. In the teeth of fierce opposition, he campaigned for immigrant enfranchisement. The combat against xenophobia and racism also goes via this right to vote. So long as it is not gained, injustice will reign, democracy will be limited to that extent, and the riposte to racism will remain abstract and impotent. The inheritor of Voltaire's mantle appeared to have inherited his predecessor's clarity of mind when it came to political argument. Things were a little different when it came to the politics of feminism. If the binary opposites of Western logical thought, true, false, mind-body, positive, negative, were to be replaced by undecidability, what became of the male-female polarity? Women may have wished to be treated as equals, undecidability, but they also insisted upon their separate identity, polarity. The way out appeared to be to stress difference in place of identity. Like the logical polarity it reinforced, patriarchy should be deconstructed. But this shouldn't be applied to feminism itself. Feminists who sought equality with men were simply repeating the old mistakes. Such feminism is the operation through which a woman desires to be like a man, like a dogmatic philosopher demanding truth, science, objectivity. That is to say, with all masculine illusions. Derrida also opposes what he calls reactive feminism, which is merely adaptive and self-limiting. On the other hand, active feminism asserts difference, making it positive. Many feminists have seen all this as mere rhetoric, but Derrida and deconstructionism have nonetheless retained a strong American advocate in the person of Barbara Johnson, who managed the Herculean task of faithfully translating dissemination into unreadable English. In 1992, Derrida found himself at the centre of a controversy in England. When Cambridge University offered him an honorary degree, his candidature was opposed by some members of the faculty, the first time such a thing had happened in living memory. His opponents didn't mince their words. French philosophy was run by a system of mandarins and gurus and fashions, and did not have the same standards of rigour and clarity as its British counterpart. Indeed, the French excel in fabricated terms of shifty meaning, which make it impossible to detect at what point philosophical speculation turns to gibberish. Despite such francophobic outbursts, Derrida was eventually awarded his honorary degree. Derrida has continued with his deconstructionist program. As prolific as ever, he persists in engaging the great thinkers and writers of the past in his deconstructionist dialogue. Socrates, Plato, Descartes, Kant, Rousseau, Hegel, Nietzsche, Marx, and Mallarmé, to name but a few, have all taken part, or, more accurately, been taken apart in this one-sided process. Their work is deconstructed, translating their findings into deconstructionist code. A few brief examples will suffice, the reader being left to make up his own mind concerning the point of the exercise. Freudian psychology. Derrida insists that the conscious mind is never free from traces of experience in the unconscious mind. The perceiving self, which imagines itself in the present, is in fact always being written by unconscious traces from the past, which, in its turn, is also being written by unconscious traces from its past, and so on and so on. This means that there is no such thing as a pure perception. Never one to shirk difficulties, in 1991 Derrida decided to take on board Marx, at the very time when the collapse of Marxism appeared to have been final. In Spectres of Marx, he engages in what he calls hauntology. This is the study of the ghosts, spectres, and spirits that haunt the space between the binary opposites of being and non-being, the living and the dead. Great play is made of the fact that his invented word hauntology, ontologie, sounds the same in French, which has a silent H here, as ontology, ontologie. The latter is the sphere of philosophy devoted to thinking about being, or ultimate existence. The opening sentence of Marx's Communist Manifesto reads, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." For Derrida, Marxism is not alive, as was once believed, or dead, as is now believed. Instead of this polarity, it is undecidable, a spectre. Derrida finally decides that deconstruction is really a more radical form of Marxism. With this conclusion, he succeeds in the all but impossible task of uniting almost the entire range of contemporary philosophers and political thinkers. Unfortunately, he succeeds in uniting them against him. I say almost. By this I mean all, except those who subscribe to the Parisian intellectual scene, where Derrida's conclusion is, of course, hotly contested, both for and against, inspiring just the sort of polarity that Derrida himself adjudges to be invalid. It was perhaps inevitable that Derrida would at one point focus on James Joyce, whose mastery of verbal sleight of hand is, if anything, the very opposite of Derrida's. Joyce's use of language is both readable and entertaining, adds richness of meaning to what it describes without obliterating either its meaning or the object of its description, and carries no anti-philosophical agenda. "Is there a limit to the interpretations of Joyce?" asks Derrida. No, he decides. Then he appears to contradict this by explaining that Joyce has encompassed the possibility of all possible interpretations before us. Curiously, Derrida decided to tackle Joyce's Ulysses rather than Finnegan's Wake, which might more easily have approached some agenda of infinite interpretation without ultimate meaning. As it is, even this aberration of genius has its impressionist drift of meaning beneath the blizzard of neologisms, puns, and solipsist solecisms. 3 quarks for Mr. Mark. Sure he hasn't got much of a bark, and sure any he has, it's all beside the mark. Long before Derrida deconstructed Joyce, the American nuclear scientist Murray Gell-Mann was reading Finnegan's Wake for pleasure. When Gell-Mann discovered a new species of subatomic particles, he playfully decided to name them quarks, selecting the word from the preceding quote. For Joyce, the literary neologist, the word quark is open to a variety of punning and amusing interpretations. For Derrida, it could doubtless be deconstructed to the point of meaninglessness. For Gell-Mann, and now the entire scientific world, it is the precise name for a species of subatomic particles having a spin of a half and electric charge plus 2/3 or minus 1/3 units, which combine to form the hadrons, but have not been detected in a free state. In the above parable of interpretations, one is a literary use of language, another is a scientific use. What, if anything, the other is, remains entirely up to you, as of course Derrida would agree. Derrida. Mixed quotes and mixed reviews. When I speak, I am conscious of being present for what I think, but also of keeping as close as possible to my thought a signifying substance, a sound carried by my breath. Jacques Derrida. All attempts to define deconstruction are bound to be false. One of the principal things in deconstruction is the delimiting of ontology, and above all of the third-person present indicative, propositions of the form S is P. Jacques Derrida. As soon as present speech bears witness to the truth of this revelation beyond the true or the false, beyond what is truthful or lying in a given statement or symptom in their relation to a given content, the values of adequation or unveiling no longer even have to await their verification or achievement from the exterior of some object. Jacques Derrida. Derrida's deconstruction attempts to show that everyday language is not neutral. It bears within it the presuppositions and cultural assumptions of a whole tradition. Maybe this anti-populist yet anti-Platonic element is Derrida's most important contribution. John Lechte. Derrida is alluding to that long tradition in philosophy from Plato to Heidegger which has sought to establish grounds or foundations for reason itself. Such grounds may turn out to be unavailable. Christopher Norris. It may be in the questioning of reason itself, a questioning nonetheless patient and meticulously argued, that philosophy can best live up to its present responsibilities. Christopher Norris. Derrida was considered by some the most important philosopher of the late 20th century. Unfortunately, nobody was sure whether the intellectual movement he spawned, deconstruction, advanced philosophy or murdered it. Jim Powell. America is an immigrant nation, and as such has a multiplicity of perspectives on life, language, and behaviour that snobbish, homogeneous France, suppressing its resident Algerians, lacks. Derrida, an Algerian Jew, had his own private agenda that is not applicable to America. Camille Paglia. Barthes is echoing Derrida's critique of the theological simultaneity of the book, the metaphysical presupposition that the essence of a text is a simultaneous network of reciprocal relationships, and thus that the dimensions of temporality and volume are purely contingent. Michael Moriarty. Deconstruction is a theory which appears to lend itself most readily to babbling obfuscation. Peter Lennon. That was Philosophy in an Hour, Derrida, by Paul Strathern. Read by Jonathan Keeble.